Okay, hello everybody. I'm very sorry for the late start. Um, Let me get the video up and going here. One second. All right, just one second. I'm waiting for our host to join us, Rabbi Benjamin Kleidman, who arranged this evening. Give me just one moment. I know there's some people having trouble logging in, so just give me 1 second, and we're going to admit everybody here. Okay, there we are. All right. I see we got a bunch of people here. Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience. Benjamin, Rabbi Kleidman, are you with us? Can you hear me?
I can.
There we are.
Yeah.
Terribly sorry for the delay. Zoom was telling me that my account was somehow compromised, and I had to go through a whole verification thing to get access to it again. So I'm really sorry about that. Would everybody please mute their microphones? I'm going to mute everybody except for, where we go? Rabbi Kleidman, I'm sending you something to unmute, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. I'm now unmuted.
All right.
Um, yeah. Okay. So just very briefly, as I said in my email on my other statements, and once I'm done here, I'll try to go back and pick up stragglers. I'm sponsoring this in exclusive for my father for his upcoming yard site. And I'm hoping to make and sponsor an annual series for the Chagim, both for Pesach and for Shavuos. My father was nifter just after Pesach, and my mother just minutes before the start of Yom Kippur. So I think it's kedai for me to sponsor something during those two time periods. Rabbi Bloomenstiel and I have lots and lots of interesting potential topics. This one, as I mentioned, it's kind of like, what do I do with the Zohar? And I've had many conversations with Rabbi Bloomenstiel about just that, that issue. And he very kindly agreed to give us a schmooze on this topic. We're doing this via a sponsorship through the shul that Rabbi Bloomenstiel belongs to, which is Congregation Torah Chaim in Dallas. And in the merit of my father's memory, Rabbi Bloomenstiel, if you would please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead. I have a slideshow I'm going to put up here. And to avoid some of the difficulties of having to rely on Zoom and PowerPoint, I'm just going to share a PDF of it so we can all see. Give me 1 second to get this thing loaded. And okay. So there we are. So I'm going to stop occasionally for questions as we go through this. This is dangerous territory. What we're talking about tonight, which is hopefully the first in a series that Rabbi Kleidman is going to sponsor, is the Sefer HaZohar, the Splendid Mysteries of the Book of Splendor. This is dangerous territory. Today, if in many, if not most circles in the frum world, to say anything that appears critical of the Zohar and of its legitimacy is to get yourself branded as not Bikoros. Someone recently asked one of our Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael if it was mutter to doubt that to doubt the authorship of the Zohar from being from Shimon Bar Yochai, and he said it's like doubting. He said it's a suffix on the legitimacy of Torah Shebal Peh. Of course, you're not Bikoros to say such. I kind of found that amazing myself because the emes is that you find that throughout history we have a long history of people questioning the authorship of the Zohar. Um, and the near universal embracing of the Zohar as being entirely from Shimon Bar Yochai is a relatively recent phenomenon. Historically speaking, the Zohar was always as famous for its content as it was for the mysteries that shroud its origin and its authorship. Um, I think that in our times, I believe in my heart of hearts that it's futile to try to solve these mysteries. The Zohar is firmly embedded to varying degrees in the fabric of Jewish thought and belief. And the answers as to exactly how it came to be are really lost to time and to memory. So whatever we've not solved by now is not likely to be known until Yemos HaMashiach, B'mheirav Yimeinu. So even though it's difficult to attempt to resolve many of the questions and controversies about the Zohar, um, even though it's difficult to resolve many of these questions, I think that the controversies and the questions themselves hold a significant amount of meaning, and the controversies deserve to be objects of study because they force us to think a lot about issues of meaning, transmission, the nature of authority in Torah, the nature of text in a way that we don't, the nature of what we consider legitimate and illegitimate. These are controversies that force us to think about these questions in a way that we might never consider them or never think of them to begin with. So tonight we're going to look at the history of the book itself, the mysteries surrounding its origins. And spoiler alert, we're not going to solve anything. We're doing this in an hour. To do this justice, we need 15 hours, if not 20 hours. But we're doing this in a very cursory overview. So let's start off with the big question. Where did the Zohar come from? Okay. Well, that is the big mystery. The problem is we know an awful lot of facts about how we got the Zohar. We know an awful lot of facts. There's a lot of investigation. There's a lot of narrative. The problem is that we don't have a great narrative, a great story that makes sense out of those facts. We don't have a story that ties them together. So we know what the facts are, but to the great chagrin and frustration of so many historians, we don't have a single narrative that makes sense out of them. This is what we know. Let's go back to Spain in the late 1200s. We had a fellow named Moshe de Leon, Moshe ben Shimtov de Leon. Now, not a lot is known about him. We know he was a professional copyist and he lived in Avila in Spain. Avila is, and this is in the 1290s. He was originally from Guadalajara, which is why in a lot of the books discussing him, he's referred to as Moshe of Guadalajara instead of Moshe de Leon. Now, these places are somewhat important because we're going to come back to them. So let's keep track of them. So he lived in Avila, right here, right in the belly button in the dead center of Spain. This is about 74, 75 miles south of Valladolid, which is going to be a very important place in the story. Right between the two, smack dab in the middle, is a city called Erevalo. All right, so we have Valladolid, Erevalo, and Avila in Spain. Now, starting in the late 1290s, he began copying and distributing out pamphlets that he claimed came from a manuscript that he found in a cave 30 years earlier when he was a young man. Now, he shockingly claimed that everything contained in these manuscripts were, what was contained in these manuscripts was material that was written. It was a manuscript from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the Tanaim in the second century. Now, what did this book look like? He was giving out pamphlets with parts of it, but what did the whole thing look like, the whole manuscript that he had that was called the Zohar? First of all, and importantly, the Zohar was huge. This is very important to realize. It was massive. It's about 1,700 pages. And it was in three broad parts. The first is called the Zohar al HaTorah, which is the main text of the Zohar. It's a midrash that goes through most of the parshios of the Torah. The second part is what's called the Tikunei Zohar, which consists of 70 interpretations of the word Bereshis, with which the Torah began. We have this, we're told that there's Shivim Panim Torah, there's 70 faces of the Torah. This is 70 different ways of understanding the word Bereshis. And then the last part is the Zohar Chadash, which appears to be later manuscripts and appendices added to the main body of the text. This is, and we're just talking about the physical description of it right now. We'll talk about the material in a moment. Now, if you look at these three books, if you're really ma'ayin in them, what you discover is that they're not three clean books. Really, these three parts are made up of what you can identify as really 23 different books. There's 23 different texts in this. And just for example, you have the main text, which goes up to Parshas Pinchas and in Bamidbar. And then you have in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, you'll have Vayeschanan, some of Vayelech, and some of Ha'azino. You have a little bit in Devarim. Then you have a commentary on Shir Hashirim. You then have a section called the Sefer Ditznusa, which is printed after Parshas Truma. In some editions, it's after Bereshis, which is a commentary on the secrets of creation. You have this section called the Idra Rabbah, which is printed in Parshas Nasa, which is like its own book, kind of dropped in the middle of the main commentary on the Torah. And it describes the chevra of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it goes on and expounds on the deep secrets of the creation of man and the structure of the soul and of the body of man. You have a section called the Idra de Mashkana, which is the at the beginning of Parshas Truma, which deals with the construction of the Mishkan. You also have a section called the Hechalos, which is there's two versions of it. One is in Parshas Bereshis, the other is in Parshas Pekudei. And it's a description of where the souls, the repository of souls after a person dies. You have a section called the Raza de Razan, right here, which is a treatise on chiromancy and physiognomy. The whole thing is based on one verse in Parshas Yisro. It's got parts of Raza de Razan are in the main text. Some of it is found in the Zohar Chadash. So not only do you have multiple books, but they're all kind of smeared and occur in different places in the three main sections. You have a very fascinating section called Sabad the Mishpatim, which is the Mishpat of the old man, is what it's called. It's printed in the main text of the Zohar in Parshas Mishpatim. And it recounts this very odd story of these Talmidei Chacham that are traveling with Rav Yaveh Saba, who was a great Makubal, who hid his identity in the guise of a donkey driver. And he lectures on the mysteries of the soul, and he expounds upon the story of the slavery of Mitzrayim that the Jews suffered in Mitzrayim as a metaphor for the soul in this world. There's also a section called the Yanuka, which means the child, which is it's found in the Zohar. It's in the third Chelek in Parshas Balak. It's all about a child prodigy, the son of Rav Hamdan Nasava, where he expounds on like the grace after meals, the Birkas Hamazon, and other things while he's got these rabbis sort of guesting in his mother's house. So these are all, and again, this is just a sampling of 23 different books that make up the Zohar. So when you really get into the Zohar, it becomes very clear that it's a compilation of multiple books, multiple texts that are not discrete. They're woven together. You'll have a bit of one text in this section, then it's continued in another section. However, they're all united by certain common themes, certain speakers, certain symbolism, and certain tones. They're threads of ideas that bind all of these texts together. Interestingly, earlier Kabbalistic works, because there was Kabbalah before the Zohar, by the way, we tend to forget that. That's very important to realize. Earlier Kabbalistic works tended to focus very strongly on what the Ramchal in Derech Hashem describes as the top-down, the deterministic influence of how Hashem interacts with our world. The Zohar, however, is very concerned with what the Ramchal calls the indeterminate influence, how what we do here has a hashpah and an effect on Shemayim, and then how Shemayim responds on this two-way influence between how Shemayim influences this world, how we react influences Shemayim. Also, the Zohar, to a much larger degree than prior works in Kabbalah, is very interested in this in the idea of, for lack of the Shekhinah, the idea of masculine and feminine aspects of how we perceive Hashem. Again, Hashem is one. Hashem does not really have masculine, feminine aspects, but in our perception of God, of Hashem, there are masculine and feminine aspects. And these are parables. Metaphor is a bad word, but these are parables for how Hashem relates to the world. The Zohar deals with this in a much larger degree, but these themes show up throughout all of these disparate parts of the Zohar. Now, when it appeared, no one had ever seen anything like it. It basically just fell out of the sky. I mean, the guy literally found it in a cave, all right? And given the size and breadth of it, the uniqueness of the content, and the fact that it was from one of the Tanaim, caused an earthquake throughout the Jewish world. And news spread very, very quickly. News eventually reached Eretz Yisrael, where in Eretz Yisrael you had many, many Talmidim of the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, known as Nachmanides, all right? Yeah, the Ramban had fled Spain in the 1260s after the disputation of Barcelona, which he won, but he got kicked out of Spain anyway. And by 1267, a few years before he passed away in 1270, he had established himself in Eretz Yisrael in the Old City. His shul, which I have the photo of here, the Ramban shul, still exists. It's actually underneath the chorva. If anyone's been there recently, where they rebuilt the chorva shul, it's like the ground floor of that is actually the shul of the Ramban. The Ramban was an incredible omnibus Talmud Chacham. He was Spanish originally, and he was raised in the hardcore rationalist bent that medieval Spain had. It was the imprint of the Ramban and the Mor Nevuchim, although it was controversial. But he learned in Provence. He learned possibly from the Hasidei Ashkenaz, so he really had this sort of pan-European Torah education. He was very eclectic, and somehow he welded it all together. He was one of the greatest sages of the medieval era. When he settled in Eretz Yisrael, he was teaching Kabbalah to a group of very dedicated Talmidim and Gedolim who were in Eretz Yisrael. One of the rumors about the origin of the Zohar is that the manuscript had been sent from Eretz Yisrael to Spain, that the Ramban was trying to get it to his son in Spain. It got diverted and ended up where it was basically found in a hole somewhere by Moshe de Leon. So when news of this story reached Eretz Yisrael and reached the Talmidim of the Ramban, they were justifiably skeptical. They were extremely, extremely skeptical because they had never heard from their master the existence of such a book. They'd never seen the manuscript. They never heard anything in the Zohar quoted by him. And they viewed him as the arch makubal. And the story that it came from Eretz Yisrael just made it more suspicious. Now, they picked a top scholar, one of their top people, a gentleman who was known as Yitzchak ben Shmuel of Akko from Eretz Yisrael. He was one of the chief Talmidim of the Ramban. He was a master makubal. And he was already in Spain by this time. He had to, due to all the political chaos in Eretz Yisrael in the Middle Ages, he was already back in Spain by around the year 1305 or so. And they tasked him to go do a full investigation on this, determine if this thing is legitimate, because we've never heard of it. If you truly have a Kabbalistic text from Shimon Bar Yochai that explains all of the Inyane Kabbalah from the Torah, this is a very, very big deal, but we never heard of it. So they sent him to investigate. He met with Moshe de Leon, the one who was publishing this, in the city of Valladolid. Why Valladolid? Which was 75 miles north of his home, because Valladolid was the closest city that had a major Beis Din. And in front of the Beis Din, Moshe de Leon took a shavua that he did in fact have the original manuscript that he discovered, and that it was back in his home in Avila. And he gave a whole testimony in front of the Beis Din as to how he found the manuscript, how it was copied. And he invited Yitzchak of Akko to come back to Avila to meet him there in 1 month, and he would produce it. Now, by the way, how do we know this story? We have Yitzchak of Akko's own narrative. It was first published over 100 years after the story transpired in the Sefer Yuchasin from Rabbi Avraham Zakuto. Now, the Sefer Yuchasin is available, but I'm going to warn you. if you go looking for the story in the Sefer Yuchasin, you might not find it. The reason why is that it's in the first edition, but this narrative was completely censored in the later editions. It wasn't until I think it was 1857. There was a complete edition published in 1857 where they restored the narrative. But even that narrative was incomplete. The original manuscript of Yitzchak of Akko was in a library in Europe, and in the 20th century, it was translated and published by none other than Aryeh Kaplan, the great Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan Zatzal, and that's how we have the complete manuscript today, and that's why it's known about. So they set off for Avila, and when Yitzchak of Akko arrived in Avila, he discovered. When he arrived in Avila to examine the manuscript, he discovered a few very shocking things. One is that Rav Moshe de Leon never made it back home. About 3 weeks earlier, Moshe de Leon stopped in Eravalo and inconveniently died. He died en route. When he arrives in Avila, he discovers that the family is still in Shloshim. They're still observing mourning for him. The second thing he found is that the family of Rav Moshe de Leon lived in abject poverty and squalor. They lived at the edge of the town, and they were people kind of kept their distance from them. They were very standoffish, didn't really interact with the rest of the people in the city. There was an odd relationship between them and other people there. People didn't want to talk about them. That was also something. Lastly, when he attempted to visit the widow, they wouldn't even open the door to him. They refused to speak to him when he showed up at the widow's home. So the Ri of Akko, Rav Yitzchak, began to interview the locals, and he met a fellow named David Dafan Korpo, who told him a story. So we're already like a secondhand story now, that there's a wealthy Baal Chassid, a community leader named Yosef of Avila. Now, we don't know for certain whether Rav Yitzchak of Avila ever met with Yosef of Avila, but this is the story that we know Yosef of Avila told David Dafan Korpo, who told the Ri. When Moshe de Leon died, Rav Yosef knew how poor the family was, and the only income they had was from Moshe de Leon's work as a copyist. So he said, I tell you what, he told the widow, I'll buy this manuscript from you for an exorbitant price, a ridiculous princely price. It'll be enough to marry off the daughters. You'll be set for life. The widow said, I can't do that. He kept pushing her and pushing her. She can't do that. And she finally broke down crying, and she told him it was all a lie. He never found such a manuscript. He wrote it himself. He made it up. It's his own work. And he attributed it to Tanayim because he knew that way it would get more popularity and he'd make more money off of it. Rav Yitzchak of Akko also uncovered that there had been prior suspicions of false attribution by Moshe de Leon and other things that he had published. Now, have any of you, just a quick show of hands, have any of you guys ever heard this story before? Has anybody ever heard this story? Anyone? There's a little thing where you can hold up your hand in Zoom. No? Craig Gordon. Got the thumbs up from Craig Gordon. I got the thumbs up from Jordan. Yeah. I got the thumbs up from everyone. Oh, look, I even got the little thing there. This is a very, very famous Maisa, this story. And a lot of people quote this story, and they use this to delegitimize the Zohar. They use this to say, oh, look, you see, the widow admitted it's a forgery. That's a mistake. The story does not end there. I'll tell you why. Despite this, Yitzchak of Akko concluded the Zohar was legitimate. That's the punchline. Despite all this evidence, he concluded it was legitimate. Now, this is where the story gets twisty-turny, wibbly-wobbly. These are the points that swayed him. First of all, De Leon never made any money. And by the way, Rivka, I see you have your hand up. If it's for a question, I'm going to stop in just a moment for questions, okay? He never made any money from the Kuntresim and the copies of the Zohar. He didn't sell them. He gave them away. That's the first thing. Second thing, he had a chevra of students that he learned Kabbalah with. They all testified universally that they had seen the manuscript, that he had brought it to them, that they'd learned through it, they'd been allowed to handle it, and it was indeed ancient. and they all describes the same manuscript. Most significantly, and this is the one that I find the most interesting, Rav Moshe de Leon wrote several books on Kabbalah. His most famous was a Sefer called the Sefer Rimon. Today it's mostly forgotten about. But if you look at the Zohar and you look at the Sefer Rimon from Moshe de Leon, the Zohar disproves Moshe de Leon's own ideas. The Zohar contradicts his own writings. The Zohar ruins his own career. Moshe de Leon is completely forgotten about because the Zohar rendered his own writings worthless. This, to me, is the most interesting point. We don't like to talk about this. We don't like to talk about this. But there is, in fact, a history of literary forgery in Judaism. The most famous forged text is, in recent times, is the section of Kodshim on the Talmud Yerushalmi. There was a fellow named Friedlander who forged an entire Seder of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi we have today is missing Seder Kodshim completely. There's a guy who forged it. And he fooled many, many Gedolim. Even the Chofetz Chaim was taken in by it, because the Chofetz Chaim quotes it. He quotes a rationale from a Seches Chulin in the Yerushalmi from the forgery in Likutei Halachos from the Chofetz Chaim as a justification for putting on Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. So many great Gedolim were taken in by this. The Sefer HaEshkol attributed to Rav Yitzchak of Narbonne, I think I actually may have the name wrong, but there are two versions of it. One was a ziyah for forgery, one is legitimate. So these things, this is something that happens in the Jewish world occasionally, not a lot. There's the famous Besamim Rosh of 1793, which is almost certainly a forgery of responsa attributed to the Rosh. This does happen. You want to read a wild, wild story. There's a fellow named Yudel Rosenberg, who was famous for these invented manuscripts. The most famous manuscript that we know he invented claims that the Maharal created a golem. Think about what I just said. That's the origin of the Maharal golem story, by the way. It is a known manuscript that was a forgery. So we have a history of this. But if you look at the pattern of literary forgery, and they're rare, but these things do happen. But if you look at these instances, the Zohar doesn't match any of them. And I'll tell you why. Almost no one forges manuscripts for money. We all know how Jewish publishing works. There's no money in it. I'm trying to, my commentary on the Haggadah was supposed to come out this year along with another Sefer I wrote during COVID. I'm going through it right now. You lose money publishing Jewish books. No one gets rich doing that. You publish it because you want to, you forge stuff because you want to substantiate your ideas and secure your own reputation. You don't publish things that contradict you and undo all of your prior work. That's the thing. You don't find that happening. So to me, it's fascinating that the Zohar contradicts his own writings. So Rav Yitzchak of Akko he went through the Zohar Mareshis itself, and even though the manuscript in the Sefer Yuchasin does not say his conclusion, if you look in Rav Yitzchak of Akko's own Sfarim, for example, the Sefer Otzer Achayim, he concludes that the Zohar is legitimate, and he attributes it to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. That's his conclusion, and he even relies on it as legitimate. So despite this third-hand testimony from the widow, he doesn't buy her testimony. Now, by the way, we'll fast forward. The academic scholar of the Zohar, Gershom Scholem, who also concluded that the Zohar was a medieval creation and not from Shimon Bar Yochai. By the way, his scholarship today is mostly considered archaic. A lot of it's been refuted by Moshe Idel and contemporary scholars of Kabbalah. But Gershom Scholem also held that the Zohar was not from Shimon Bar Yochai. But even Gershom Scholem did not buy the testimony of the widow because it was a third-hand testimony. It was someone saying that someone said that someone said that she said. And also, too, we know that he never sold it for money. So the testimony of the widow was generally, people don't put a lot of stock in that. Elaine Rubin is asking what happened to the widow of De Leon. We don't know what happened to her after this. At least I'm not aware of it. So for the next 200 years, the truth is you didn't have a lot of complaints about the Zohar for about the next 200 years. You didn't hear much about it. It was accepted, and it was something that people learned. you don't really have criticism. You had grumblings about it over the next 200 years or so. You had grumblings. People had problems with certain parts of the Zohar. You didn't have a wholesale criticism of it until about the late 1490s, when you had a fellow, Rabbi Eliyahu del Medigo. Excuse me one second. Rabbi Eliyahu del Medigo, who was a rabbi from Crete, which at that point was actually ruled by the Venetian Republic. So he was Italian. And he bounced around Italy in the 1400s. He was very much a hardcore rationalist. And he wrote the first book that was a wholesale criticism of the Zohar. And he really brings 5 questions about it. He says, and what he did is he tied together all of sort of the grumblings you heard from the gallery about the Zohar. The first issue, he says, is the Zohar is not mentioned in any earlier work. There's no earlier writing that discusses it. It's not mentioned in the Midrashim. It's not mentioned in the Gemara. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah. You don't find it. That was his first issue. Second issue, and this is a really good point. The Zohar quotes sages who lived after Shimon Bar Yochai. There are people after Shimon Bar Yochai that get quoted in the Zohar. The third problem is, if this is such an important, legitimate work, then where was it? Where was it for 1,300 years? From the times of the Tanaim to the 1300s, no one had ever heard of this. Where was it? Fourth, if Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had all of this great mystical insight, and he was getting messages from heaven, and he could speak to Malachim, and all these stories recorded in the Zohar, then why are so many of his opinions in halacha rejected? And lastly, what do we do with all the disputes in the Zohar between the Zohar and the Gemara, which is established halacha? Now, let me ask you guys this, and you are welcome to unmute yourself, okay? And if you put up your hand if you want to give an answer, I'm more than happy to unmute anybody here. And actually, I'm going to see if I can just unmute everybody. I don't know how to do that. All right, everyone's allowed to unmute yourself. Let me ask you, just looking at these criticisms, do any of these criticisms seem weak to you? Do you have a problem with any of these criticisms of Eliyahu del Medigo? Do any of them seem misplaced? Unmute yourself. Tell me your ideas. I want to know. No, there's no trick questions here. I really want to think about these criticisms. Oh, someone's got to be brave. No one? Clydeman, you started this whole thing. Craig Gordon says there are far more criticisms. Yes, all of those criticisms, actually, you can fit in one of these 5 categories. That's very, very correct. But does anyone have problems with these criticisms? Because I have problems with some of these criticisms. All right, I won't torture anyone any longer. Some of these criticisms are not good. They're not good criticisms, and I'll tell you. And I'll tell you who made this point. A descendant of Eliyahu del Medigo, of his, named Rabbi Yosef Shlomo del Medigo. All right. Oh, hold on one second. Allow. Okay, now you can unmute yourself if you want to speak. I just fixed it.
To me, they all do seem like legitimate criticisms.
Yeah.
I mean, especially number 2 seems especially cogent. You know, if you want to say it's from Shimon Bar Yochai, so how does it happen that he's quoting people who lived after Shimon Bar Yochai? Unless you want to say some of it was written later.
Okay.
Some earlier.
That's a strong one. The anachronisms in the Zohar, which are legion, I think Craig Gordon made a remark, there are far more criticisms. Many of the strongest criticisms deal with the anachronisms of the Zohar. Some of these are good, some of these are not good. And I'll tell you who really came back to rebut this was actually a descendant of his, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo del Medigo, who lived from 1591 to 1655. He had really big problems with his ancestor's book, and he wrote a rebuttal of it called the Matzah L'Chochmah. Now, to his credit, he also published the Bechinas Hadas. He published his ancestor's book, and then he wrote a rebuttal to it. And he goes point by point. He says, first of all, the Zohar is not referred to in the Gemara, the earlier writings. Of course it isn't. Lots of books are not referred to in the Gemara. That's not surprising. The Gemara doesn't refer to, there's a lot of midrashim the Gemara doesn't refer to. The Gemara is primarily dealing with the legalistic aspects of the Torah. It's not that interested in the mystical. There are places it discusses the mystical. The famous one is in Chagiga Daf Yudalet. But it's not, you wouldn't expect in a textbook on carpentry to find the discussion on doing kidney transplants. That's kind of his argument. 2, he says it quotes sages who lived after Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, he makes a very important point here, and he's right about this. He says that doesn't impinge the legitimacy of the Zohar, because the Gemara quotes people who live after Ravina and Rav Ashi, who supposedly were the editors who closed the Gemara. But we have sages who live after them mentioned in the Gemara. I'm not going to elaborate on that now. We're going to save that for down the road, but put a pin in that. He acknowledges, and he's a defender of Kabbalah, he's a defender of the Zohar. He says, yes, there are sages that came after Shimon Bar Yochai that are named. That does not change the fact that it's from Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, how we square that circle, we're going to get to in a minute. All right. Number 4, if Shimon Bar Yochai's insight was so great, then why are so many of his opinions rejected? This is, to me, the weakest argument that Rav Eliyahu Del Medigo makes. And this is the one that is a misplaced argument. Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Del Medigo correctly rebuts this, and he says, look at the Gemara in Bava Metzia, all right, 59b. What do we have over there? This is the Tanur Achnai, the famous machlokas between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer over the Tanur Shel Achnai, and whether it was Tameh or whether it was Tahor, and he's arguing with the sages. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, have the carob tree pick up and walk. If I'm right, let the river run backwards. If I'm right, let the walls of the Beis Mikdash bend. If I'm right, let heaven declare it. And the heavenly voice says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And Rabbi Yeshua plants his feet on the ground and points at Shemayim and says, Torah lo b'Shemayim he. We learn halacha and we prove things through learning Torah. We don't listen to heavenly voices. In other words, the mystical is no proof to halacha. That's what he says. He tells Hashem to stay out of it. We don't listen to miracles to prove. The Torah was given to us to learn, to us to make decisions. Okay? So he's absolutely right. The factor of Shimon Bar Yochai, the argument up here of Rabbi Eliezer Del Medigo is he says that if Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's insight was so great, then why are so many of his opinions rejected? That has nothing to do with the Zohar, because we don't decide halacha based on mystical insight. So that is Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Del Medigo makes a point. That's a terrible argument. On the last part, and Rabbi Yosef Shlomo is trying to defend the Zohar. Why are there so many disputes in halacha between the Gemara and the Zohar? The Zohar contradicts a lot of things. On this, and this is way beyond what we can get into here, he tries to explain that they're not really halachic discrepancies. These are midrashic expositions on the halacha. They're not really meant to be legalistic. Or he tries to attribute them to, that yes, there is a mystical approach, but it's not dispositive final halacha. He has a hard time explaining it. But what he basically comes down on is he says that in the Gemara and in the Midrashe HaHalacha that we have, the Sifre, the Sifra, all of these Midrashim, we find, pick at the Rebbe Eliezer, we find that there are things that disagree with halacha because there are midrashic interpretations we don't hold as halacha. He's not wrong about that. He has a hard time arguing with a lot of things in the Zohar, but he's not wrong. So really, the only criticisms of his ancestor that really stand, that really kind of stand and that we have to contend with. Oh, I left off one here. Oh, I only did 1, 2, 3. All right, so the third criticism is that it was not known until 1300. Where was it? All right, we're going to come to that. Rabbi Yosef Del Medigo, he successfully, I think, rebuts number 1. He doesn't rebut number 2. He's right. That's a hard going. I think successfully rebuts number 4. He successfully rebuts number 5. All right. But he when he says, why wasn't it known for 1,300 years? He says it was the ratzon of Hashem that it not be revealed until we get closer to the age of Mashiach, that it was a divine will. I don't like that criticism. That's very circular, and you have no way to prove that. But I think that we're going to see that these are actually pretty good criticisms. The problem is they're not specific enough, because someone comes a few years later, Rav Yaakov Emden, and reawakens all of these criticisms of Rav Elia del Medigo, but he does it on a much higher level than either Rav Eliyahu del Medigo or Rav Yosef Shlomo del Medigo we're dealing with. And that's where it gets hard. Yeah, Craig, go ahead. Craig, you can unmute if you want. I see you had your hand up. Craig, are you still there? Oh, his microphone's not working. All right, Craig, did you have a question? Do you want to type it? I see he's posting in the direct messages here. Go ahead and type your question. I'm going to keep going, and when you're done, I'll come back to it, okay? Oh, that the language is wrong. Okay, this is a famous criticism for Gershom Scholem. We're going to come back to that. Yeah, there's a lot of linguistic anachronisms, but we're going to come back to that, okay? Okay. There was another, so that was in the 1500s. In the late 1600s, you had another criticism that came from the Ari Nochem, which was by Rav Leon of Modena. Rav Leon of Modena is a whole crazy topic in and of himself, and I'm gonna kind of skip his criticism because I don't think it adds a lot to the final point that we're heading to. But what I do want to get to is the next major criticism, which was from Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden. He wrote a Sefer in the 1750s called Mitpachas HaSfarim. This was going on during the era of the Shabbatian controversies. Now, for those of you who do not know, there are a few cataclysmic events in Jewish history. There's the destruction of the temple. There is the exile of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And I'm talking global cataclysms for the Jewish world. I am not going to include the Crusades in this because the effect of the Crusades was primarily in France, Germany, and some of the Middle East. The Crusades are up there with the cataclysmic event, but they're not on par with the 3 I'm mentioning now. I would rate them a little bit lower. Historians can disagree with me, but if you look at things that threatened the existence of the entire Jewish world, there's the destruction of the temples, the exile from Spain in 1492, and the arrival of a bipolar paranoid schizophrenic named Shabtai Tzvi, who became a false messiah and almost destroyed the Jewish world from within. The howling void of chaos that was unleashed by the Shabbatian movement, which is an insane story, cannot be overstated. It cannot be overstated, the effect this had in the 1600s. The mess that it left in his wake was basically cleaned up by a number of Rabbanim, but one of the leaders in the Ashkenaz role was Rav Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden, who was the son of the Hacham Tzvi. The Hacham Tzvi was called upon, the Shabbatians used the Zohar to justify this very corrupt cult that they had devolved into. And just to give you an idea as to how corrupt it was, there was a large sect of Shabbatians that converted to Christianity. And there was a rabbi in the 1700s who lamented it, saying, oh, whoa, now we've lost, there's no chance of them coming back. And everyone else said, no, that's a sign of hope. Them converting to Christianity is a step back toward normative Judaism. That gives you an idea as to how far out the Shabbatians were. Converting to Christianity was actually a step back in the right direction. That gives you an idea as to how insane and out there it really was. So he was trying to counter this. Now, the Shabbatians, to justify this cult they developed, it was all based on the Zohar and on Shabtai Tzvi and Nosson of Gaza's reading of the Zohar, who was the prophet of the Shabbatian movement. And the public was eating up what they were saying. They would quote a Gemara, they would quote something, and they would say, what it really means we understand from the Zohar. And the public loved this. And they built adherence based on this selling this mystical snake oil, which was their way of reading the Zohar. So they called upon Rav Yaakov Emden to examine the legitimacy of the Zohar. Rav Yaakov Emden did it, but he did it reluctantly. He said that his conclusions on the Zohar, he felt like Hizkiyahu destroying the Nachash or hiding the Sefer Refuos. For those of you who get the reference, you get it. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to get into it. But he examined the Zohar, and he had over 300 very pointed criticisms of the Zohar. By the way, Rabbi Yaakov Emden is one of the great critical minds of the Jewish world. He's one of the greatest minds we ever had. He concluded that the Zohar was almost all, that it was not by Shimon Bar Yochai. That's number one. Number two, it was most of the material is from later Amoraim, not the Tanaim. He identified many sections of it that were from the era of the Gaonim, and he could show from the text and the analysis of the language they were from the Gaonim. He concluded that the sections of Raya Mehemna and the Tikkunei Zohar are almost entirely medieval, if not by Moshe DeLeon himself. So he believed that the Zohar had parts of it that were ancient from the times of the Amoraim. There were Gaonic editions, and there was stuff from the Middle Ages. And it was a pastiche of these things, very poorly stitched together. But he accepted it as legitimate. Even though it's not from Shimon Bar Yochai, it has some value and legitimacy as Torah. This is extremely, extremely important. He is telling us that the legitimacy of the Zohar's provenance is not directly related to its legitimacy as Torah. Most people who think about the Zohar think, well, if it's not from Shimon Bar Yochai, then it's not legitimate Torah. That's a trap. That's a trap. And I'm going to explain why. All right. And by the way, for those of you who don't know me while I'm here, I am a dyed-in-the-wool Frankfurt, if not, Rav Hamburger, Shoshe Minhag Ashkenaz Yeka. I don't keep any minhagim from the Zohar. I'm the last person in the world to stand up and teach Zohar. So I'm not a defender of it by far. So I have no dog in this fight. I don't say Barich Shemei. I make a bracha on tefillin during Chol HaMoed, which is, that's hardcore old world Yekish stuff. I do all that. However, without personal bias with this, I have to tell you, there's a lot of merit in, hi, Yoni. There's a lot of merit in what Rav Yaakov Emden is saying over here. So let's now pull the camera back. And I want to talk now about there's really four controversies surrounding the Zohar. It's not just, is it from Shimon Bar Yochai or is it not? When you get into the literature about the controversies, we really find four questions. And I'm going to run through these and conclude. Do we have any questions before I wrap up, by the way, on everything we've done so far? No? Okay. The first question is provenance. Who wrote it and when? That's one controversy. The second part is the Torah legitimate Torah? Meaning, is it part of the Kabbalistic Masorah, or is it something new? Because it could have been written in the Gaonic era, or it could have been composed in the medieval era as a commentary on something from the Gaonic era, and it could contain things that are from Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, but were passed down through Midrashim. It doesn't make it illegitimate as Torah. Now, if it's legitimate Torah, then there's a third question, which is, should we make this available to the general public? We all know the Gemara in Maseches Chagigiga that Maisa Merkava, Maisa Bereshis should not be taught publicly. And then the fourth question is, if it's legitimate, what influence should it have on practice? Should we keep minhagim based on Kabbalah, not based on Kabbalah, based on the Zohar, or should we not? So I'm just going to conclude by going through these quickly. Let's talk about origin and provenance. It purports to be by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. That is how it was sold to everybody. And that's what it was claimed by Moshe DeLeon and by his people. Now, the problem with this, and I think Craig Gordon alluded to this, there are tremendous glaring anachronisms, massive glaring anachronisms. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, in the generation after Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. But the Zohar has names and descriptions of people who live hundreds of years later. There are dozens of times in the Zohar where it mentions the Sefer of Rab Hamnuna Sava. And it describes Rabbi Hamnuna Saba. But Rabbi Hamnuna Saba lived at minimum 100 years after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died. It talks about Rabbi Yeva Saba, and he appears to be one of the companions of Shimon Bar Yochai. He's the one who's the poor wagon driver who reveals secrets of Torah. Problem is that Yeva Saba, according to the Gemara, was a student of Rav who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era, way, way after Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's completely anachronistic. There are subjects brought in the Zohar that are discussed that did not exist in the time of Shimon Bar Yochai. Even though the Gemara discusses the vowels, the chirik, the komatz, the patach, the haulam, even though it talks about these, and even though it talks about the mikra ta'amim, we did not have a system for notating these until very, very late. The era of the Balei Masorah, the Masorites, there were multiple competing systems for how to notate them. The one we use today is the Tavarian system. That didn't come into being until the late 900s, early 1000, the notation system. It did not exist in the time of the Gemara. Nevertheless, if you look in the Zohar in volume 1, Daf Tesvav, Daf Yud Zayin, Daf Chaf Dalet, if you look on those pages of the Zohar, it's Doresh on the shapes of the vowel markings and the shape of the Mikra Ta'amim. But they didn't exist in the time of Shimon Bar Yochai. So those must be later expositions. There are also problems in the Aramaic. There are occasional anachronisms and even words in Ladino. For example, it talks about guardian angels in a few places, and it calls them Gardini Nimusin, Gardini Tahirin. Gardini, for guardian angel, is Ladino. That's not Aramaic. It does not show up anywhere in Aramaic. So based on these anachronisms, many of the Gedolim felt, and this is really what Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, there is somewhere in the Zohar a core text, but a lot had been added to it over time. You have sections where the Aramaic is very good and sections where the Aramaic is very poor. You have sections that are located right, seem to be located right in the 1st century, 2nd century Common Era. You have sections of it that are clearly later. So this led the Chasam Sofer in his Shalos and Shuvas. He mentions this. It's also mentioned in a book, Mei Menuchos, which quotes the Chasam Sofer as having said that the Chasam Sofer said at most only a few pages were originally from the time of Shimon Bar Yochai. The rest of it are all things that have been added to it over time. They're all things that have been accreted to the Zohar, but it has a core that is legitimate. Now, this argument is not unusual, by the way. The Sefer Yetzirah we accept as legitimate. There are 4 different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, and the Sefer Yetzirah has had things added to it. Because the process of copying and transmitting manuscripts from ancient time until today was one of people copying it and adding in notes and commentary that eventually made its way into the core text. The Talmud is like that. Most of the Mephoshim say that any place in the Gemara where it says Hilchsa and it tells you the halacha, that was added in the times of the Gaonim. That was not from the original times of the Amoraim. We know that the Gemara was sealed by Ravina and Ravashi, but we know that there were Rabbanim Savarayim, and there are people after the Gemara was finished who their notes are interlineated in the text of the Gemara. Anyone who's ever learned Tosafos Rashi, this is mentioned everywhere. This is not a surprise to say this. This is just legitimately part of Torah learning. So if the Gemara we know was sealed by Ravina and Ravashi, and then there were additions afterward, but we still say it's by Ravina and Ravashi, it's not that hard to say that there are parts of the Zohar that are ancient, but there was stuff that was accreted to it. And it does not detract from the overall legitimacy or authority of the Zohar, whatever that authority or legitimacy may be. We're going to discuss that in a moment. Now, of course, the problem is we have a chain of provenance in the Gemara as to where it was edited and when things were added. We don't have that chain of provenance with the Zohar. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. That idea of the chain of provenance really gets us to the question is it part of the Masorah? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go really fast here. I cannot emphasize this enough. Kabbalah existed before the Zohar. Kabbalah existed before the Zohar. All right? This is what everybody seems to forget in discussing the Zohar. But what was Kabbalah before the Zohar? Well, we had the Sefer Yetzirah. We have some Kabbalah mentioned in Chagiga and Daf Yud Dalet. There's Kabbalah in the Gaonic literature. The whole Maisa by Rav Sadia Gaon, how he became one of the Gaonim, involved involved a number of famous Mekubalim. So we know there was Kabbalah. The Kabbalah that existed pre-Zohar, it's very hard for us to comprehend what it is. The clearest expression we have of it, to the degree we can assume it's representative of a body, is what existed among the rabbis in southern Germany in the Middle Ages, among the people who were known as the Hasidei Ashkenaz. The Hasidei Ashkenaz were ascetics, major Kabbalists in the Middle Ages, but their world of Kabbalah was very different than what we consider Kabbalah. It was woven in and out of normative Judaism, and we tend to separate it. For them, it was not. If you ever learn the Rokeach or the Tzava or the writings of Yehuda Chassid, you look at arguably the latest, the Or Zarua, which is from the latest from Rav Yitzchak of Vienna, who was the latest of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Gematria in Kabbalah is woven throughout it, and almost, in a sense, has more authority. The Gemara is almost a perush on the Kabbalah in their world. The way they learn things is not the way that we learn things. And it's almost incomprehensible sometimes to figure out how they're learning things. They also lived in a world of Kabbalah Lamaisa. There's a tshuva from the time that I saw in a collection of tshuvas from the Hasidei Ashkenaz, where someone asked, I think it was Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, they came to him with a shaila that they apparently, it was Erev Shabbos, they made a golem, and they ran out of time to bring it alive. So the question was, can you, by speaking out parts of the Zohar, the incantation they need, and by bringing it to life, is that an avera of Makabah Patesh? Is that a malacha on Shabbos? And the tshuva opens with, I can't believe I keep getting asked this question. And they conclude that it's Makabah Patesh. You can't bring a gold to life on Shabbos. By the way, I now know, having seen that tshuva, if there's ever any place, and I had a time machine, if there's ever any place in time I don't want to go, it's to Regensburg, Germany in the Middle Ages when they're doing this stuff. I don't need to meet these people. But you see that Kabbalah was very real to them. The Sephardim in the Middle Ages were very wary of Kabbalah. There was a lot of pressure from the Islamic population who were in the Kalam, which was Islamic rationalism, and to Falsaf, which was their version of Aristotelian philosophy, which, by the way, the Rambam's Mor Nevuchim is not based on Aristotle. It's based on Falsaf, which was the Arabic philosopher's version of Aristotle. All right. There was a lot of pressure on the Jewish community to account philosophically for what Judaism believes. And in the Sephardic world in the Middle Ages, there was a wariness toward Kabbalah, but the Ashkenazim wholeheartedly embraced it, which is a little different than the way we think of the world today. Oh, that's right. My father, Ameva Esrim, who's joining us, Rabbi Yitzchak Bloomenstiel, just pointed out that you learned with Rabbi Block in Regensburg. Did you guys actually get a chance to look at any of the old stuff from these guys, the Hasidei Rishonim? Oh, I don't think he can unmute. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not letting him unmute. There it is.
He didn't give me that much credit.
Okay. Thanks, Dad. All right. So the Arizal, when the Arizal came along, so when the Zohar appeared, one of the big questions about the Zohar was, did it fit into this Kabbalah that existed before? That was the big question. We had this thing called Kabbalah before the Zohar. The Zohar shows up. A lot of people's criticism, and this is often overlooked, this is actually bigger than the question of was it from Shimon Bar Yochai, because we know there's stuff in it from later. The bigger question is, was the Zohar a new idea, a new version of mysticism, which means it's not part of the Masorah and it's not legitimate? Or does it fit into the Masorah of Kabbalah that existed before? Does it plug into it somehow? There is a very big difference between the Kabbalah of the Zohar and the Hasidei Ashkenaz. And it's like this. Imagine that Torah is a forest, and the mystical parts of the Torah is some wild snorting beast with matted hair that lives in that forest. It's dangerous. The Zohar took it and put it in a zoo. We like to think of the Zohar as this wild book of Kabbalah. It's actually not. The Zohar is Kabbalah made tame into an academic form where it could be studied. The Hasidei Ashkenaz was the wild stuff. Whereas the Hasidei Ashkenaz would jump on the back of one of this wild beast and ride it through the woods. That's their approach to Kabbalah. The approach of the Zohar is to take that animal, shoot it, stuff it, and put it in a natural history museum. That's really the difference. And I've had people argue this with me a lot, but I have learned through the writings of the Hasidei Ashkenaz that have been through the Zohar. They are so different worlds as far as how it understands the nature of Kabbalah and how it interacts with Judaism. In the Zohar, it's a separate discipline. For the Hasidei Ashkenaz, it's just a wild part of the Torah jungle. That bridge between the old Kabbalah that existed before the Zohar and the Kabbalah after the Zohar, the bridge between the two was built by the Arizal. There were many people who were trying to figure out, how does the Zohar fit into our Masorah? The Arizal's greatness is he developed a system of teaching Kabbalah that demonstrated that the Zohar was an extension of the doctrine that preceded it. Not only that, but the Zohar better elaborates and explains these older concepts that existed before, which means that according to the Ari, even if you can't trace it directly to Shimon Bar Yochai, the ideas in it elevate a pre-existing Masorah. What I'm saying right now is the most important part of this whole thing. Even if it's not directly by Shimon Bar Yochai, the ideas in it elevate and enhance the Masorah of what came before it. It's because of the Ari that the Zohar has been accepted really as part of our Masorah, because he plugged it into what existed before. This is why Rabbi Yaakov Emden embraced the Zohar, even though he did not believe it was legitimately from Shimon Bar Yochai. But to make this kind of a judgment call, you have to be going in a gadol of the top tier, which Rav Yaakov ben Tzvi Emden was 100%, and the Arizal was 100%. So was Rav Moshe Cordovero, so was Rav Yosef Karo. This is why the vast majority of all Gedolei Torah hold the Zohar is legitimate Torah. The question of whether it's from Shimon Bar Yochai or not is not that relevant. This takes us really to the third question, which is publishing the hidden. And this is not resolved. The Gemara in Chagiga and Daf Yud Gimel says that certain Kabbalistic topics you should not publicize. And many Gedolim were opposed to teaching it publicly. In Mantua in 1558, when the Zohar was first published, there was a gigantic controversy over teaching it publicly. This was a very big criticism of the second Hasidim, the Hasidim Achronim, which are the Hasidim we have today. Okay, the Hasidim that exist today, because Kabbalah became taught very openly, and they were really heavily criticized for this. This is an ongoing fight, how much of this stuff should be taught openly. Unfortunately, I'll tell you that you go online, you Google Kabbalah, 99% of anything you find online about it is absolute garbage. The only person online who says anything about Kabbalah in English and knows what they're doing is Rav Yaakov Moshe Hillel. It's very hard to find anybody who knows what they're talking about. So I see the point. And also, every time that Kabbalah, we try to mainstream it, it always backfires. That's what happened during the time of Shabtai Tzvi. You got to be very careful with these things. I don't have a lot to say about the third controversy because it's still ongoing. But this really takes me to the fourth and what I think is the biggest controversy. I think the biggest controversy is this one. How much authority do we give the Zohar? It often contradicts things that are in the Talmud. What do we do with it? It depends on what it actually is. If we say that the Zohar has the status of a midrash, which I will tell you, my personal belief is I believe it's a midrash, then why should we treat it any differently than any other midrash? We don't decide halacha based on midrashim, so why should the Zohar be any different? On the other hand, if it's a Tanaic text, and it's really from Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's a Tanaic text, then we have two questions. Not only what weight do we give a newly discovered Tanaic text, because we have the Gemara that discusses this stuff, why do we need it? But also, if it has not been around for 1,300 years and no one's seen it, then it hasn't been part of the Masorah. It hasn't been part of the development of halacha. So should we give it any credence? This issue came up, by the way, in the 20th century. Almost all of the Meiri, most of the Meiri was lost. It was hiding in a library in Italy until the early 1900s when the Meiri was rediscovered. And all of a sudden it showed up. And there was a big debate over whether or not we should give the Meiri any halachic weight. Because the Beis Yosef never saw the Meiri. The author, the Kovim, who established the Shulchan Aruch, really never saw the Meiri. There are parts of the Meiri out there, but the Meiri we have today was mostly not available. So the Chazon Ish and many people have this idea that lost discovered texts, if we discover them, have no halachic validity because they were outside the development of halacha. So based on that, even if it's authoritative completely, the Zohar, even if it's a direct text, according to many people, because it was lost, we shouldn't put stock in it. I'll tell you, it's very interesting. The Maharshal, I don't remember where I saw this. I think it's in the Am Shel Shlomo. The Maharshal said that if Shimon Bar Yochai walked into his shul and told people that they needed to sit while putting on tefillin, we'd throw him out. We wouldn't listen to him because the halacha is the halacha. He missed the boat. That's what the Maharshal writes on the Zohar. So we have kind of there's an interesting relationship with it. You have some people today who hold that the Zohar is word for word from Shimon Bar Yochai. They say that why do you have later Amoraim? Well, because he wrote it with Nevuah. The anachronisms are because he was writing it for future generations. It's a very hard argument. It strains belief, but there are people that hold that way. There are people who also hold that the Zohar, we have to follow the Zohar even over established halacha in the Gemara. There are many Hasidim and some Sephardim who do paskin that way. Why they paskin that way, I don't know. You have to go ask them. It's controversial and it's difficult to follow. There are people, there's another extreme, which is people who simply follow the Gemara and establish halacha, and they simply ignore the Zohar completely. The Yekkis are famous for this. They agree, by the way, the Yekkis do believe in Kabbalah. There's this idea that Yekkis are not into Kabbalah. Yekkis are absolutely into Kabbalah, but they're more interested in the stuff before the Zohar. The Zohar, it's a midrash. So this is why among German Jews, if you go to Breuer's or any of these places, they don't say Baruch Shemay before they take out the Torah. There's none of the, Yehi Ratzon, Lichud, Shem, Yud Kei, Vav Kei, none of that stuff happens. They make a bracha on tefillin during Chol HaMoed. Just the Zohar has no influence. They respect it. Rav Hirsch even quotes from it. It's an important part of the midrash, but it does not affect halachic practice. The mainstream view, which is most Eastern European Jews and most Hasidim, is a compromise. Now, originally among the Ashkenazim, the Ashkenazim originally were very suspicious of the Zohar. The Zohar made its way into Ashkenazi practice through the Shalah, the Shnei Luchos Habris. He's the first Ashkenazi Rav and Gadol to really bring in Kabbalah into Lamaisa. And then from there, the Magen Avraham puts it into his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And that's where we start to see customs al pi Kabbalah making its way into the Ashkenaz world. It's interesting. The Shulchan Aruch says that when you say Kriya Shema, you hold the two tzitzis in front of you. You go to Breuer's, that's what everybody does. You go to Rav Hamburg and Rav Hamburger in Ramot in Eretz Yisrael, everyone holds two tzitzis in front of them. You go to Switzerland, the Yekish Kehilas, they all hold the front two. Art Scroll says you hold four. Why? That's from the Zohar. To hold the four tzitzis is from the Zohar. The halakha is to hold two. But now it's mainstream because Rabbi Arthur S. Kroll wrote it in the Art Scroll Siddur. It's like Yaharag Vel Yavor, you have to hold four. But that's one of these things from the Zohar that made it into common practice. So you have Ashkenazim that adapted it, but they make a compromise. And the Mishnah Berurah describes this compromise well. The Mishnah Berurah quotes the Knesset Hagadola, who says that any time that you have a disagreement between the Mekubalim and the Zohar with the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, you follow the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch. If, though, the Kabbalah creates a Chumrah, then you should follow the Chumrah. But that's only if the Chumrah is also mentioned in the Gemara and the codes. In other words, if the Zohar echoes a strict opinion found in the Gemara and in the codes, then as a minig, we should be strict based on the Zohar. But if the Zohar has a stringency, and that's on everyone, But if the Zohar is a stringency that's not mentioned anywhere in the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch, the Poskim, then individuals can do it, but you can't ask people to do it. Okay? You can't ask people to do it. He also says that anytime you have a disagreement that's 50-50 and you can't find a way to solve that disagreement, it's perfectly, shuckle. You can't disagree. You can use the words of Zohar to break the disagreement. That is the typical among Ashkenazi poskim. That's typically how you find it used. It's very subtle and it's very nuanced. But in a way, it's giving it authority somewhere in the realm of a halachic midrash. That's kind of the authority that the Mishnah Berurah is actually giving it. So at the end, and I'm going to end here, and then I'm going to answer some questions and take a few, and I'll stay on for another 20 minutes because we started late. So in the end, just to kind of summarize what all of this has been about, the Zohar is a very complicated history. But the problem is in the controversies themselves, it's not one controversy over the Zohar. You really have four. The most important controversy over the Zohar is, what do we do with its authority? Does it affect halacha or not? That's the most important, okay? That's the one that really we have to wrestle with today. That's the one the Shulchan Aruch wrestles with. The Mishnah Berurah has an excellent compromise. You can either treat it like it has tremendous authority on par with the poskim, which a lot of Sephardim and Hasidim do. You can do what the Ekes do, and you can ignore it. Or you can do like most Ashkenazim, following the footsteps of the Shalah, the Magen Avraham, and the Mishnah Berurah do, and they make a compromise. You use it to break ties. You use it for certain types of stringencies. That's the most important machlokas. And there's a wonderful book on this by Rav Yaakov Moshe Hillel called Gevuras Ha'ari, if you want to read about all the halachic discussions of the Zohar versus established halacha. The second machlokas is, how much does the Zohar actually fit into the Masorah of Kabbalah? The Arizal solved that for us. The Arizal kasher the Zohar. It does flow out of some legitimate Masorah of Kabbalah. The third dispute, which I would say actually should be number two. The most important is the authority. The second most important is, should you teach it publicly? I got my order wrong. Should you teach it publicly? That's an ongoing dispute we have to deal with. The third one is it part of the Masorah? That was solved by the Ari. And the fourth dispute, is it actually by Shimon Bar Yochai? I think is the one that matters the least. I really do. Because what we see is it clearly isn't from Shimon Bar Yochai, or at least parts of it are not from Shimon Bar Yochai. And the way it seems to me is that saying that you wholesale don't believe anything in the Zohar is legitimate, that's a problem, because the Zohar does contain things that are clearly outgrowths of established Masorah. The problem is it falsely attributes parts of it to a person who we know couldn't have written it. But there are ideas in there that are legitimate Torah. But I think saying that it's not from Shimon Bar Yochai, I don't see why people freak out when you say that. There's so much evidence that most of it is later, And I think it's important to make that very subtle distinction that the Zohar can be legitimate Torah without it being necessarily 100% by Shimon Bar Yochai. Because again, if it's a manuscript that was found by Moshe DeLeon, it's Moshe DeLeon who said it was from Shimon Bar Yochai. The Zohar itself doesn't say it's all by Shimon Bar Yochai. Think about that for a moment. The Zohar itself doesn't say it's all from Shimon Bar Yochai. Large parts of it are attributed to him. It's Moshe DeLeon who said that. So why do we need to believe him? So I think that's kind of where I come down on it. And then the question of should you teach it publicly and what its authority is, those are questions to be determined by people who are, in more positions of authority than I am. I just run a Beis Din in a city in the middle of nowhere, which, as much as I love my community, I love it here in Dallas, Texas, we are kind of outside of, we're not an in-town community, I'll put it that way, Okay, so I'm going to go answer a couple of questions we have over here. Okay, first of all, Elaine Rubin asks, is it accurate to call the Tanya a summary of the Zohar? No. The Tanya is an attempt by Rav Shneur Zalman Baruchovich, also known as Shneur Zalman of Liadi, to create a unified philosophy of Hasidus that ties together Kabbalah and Hasidic thought. Okay? That's what Tanya is. Tanya is a unique attempt from Lubavitch to tie a thread around Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought. Ideas in the Tanya were not accepted by other people. The Vilna Gaon had problems with things in Tanya. Even Rav Nachman of Breslov is quoted in the Chaim Aron and other places saying that he disagreed with the conclusions in Tanya. So Tanya is a book of Hasidic thought that draws heavily on Kabbalah, but it is unique to Lubavitch. I have learned large sections of Tanya. I got very little out of it personally. There are people it speaks to them, it doesn't speak to me. Let's see here. What else do we have? Richard Kleidman says, so a possible take-home message is that the value of the Zohar is to add context to earlier Kabbalah. I think the value of the Zohar is it preserves the Masorah of Kabbalah in a form that makes it capable of being studied and transmitted. The Mishnah had to be written down because the living culture of halacha that was the world was falling apart and people were losing it. So it had to be captured in writing for the purpose of transmission. I suspect that the Zohar was an attempt to take these things, these integral Kabbalistic parts of Judaism, like in the times of Hasidei Ashkenaz, that people sort of took as just part of the air and atmosphere of Judaism, and put it in a form to be preserved and studied. I think that's what it is. I don't think it so much illuminates earlier parts, but I think it may have been an attempt to preserve them. But again, the problem is the provenance is the big question. We really are relying very strongly on the Arizal and later commentators to explain to us how it fits in. And we have to trust them if we want to. Craig Gordon says, number one, the tenets of the Zohar delve deeply into the complex structure of the divine realms of the Sephirotic manifestations. Reality, the multiplicity of God, which discusses the absolute unity, is discussed by the Rambam. Okay? As such, given the ramifications, are we assuming the Zohar is not a reliable tradition? All right, if the Zohar has legitimate Torah, then why can't we learn legitimate Torah from other than Zohar? All right, so Craig Gordon, I'm going to be, forgive me for saying this, there's a number of erroneous assumptions in the comment. I'm not criticizing, I'm just pointing out there's some, and it may be the way it's worded, okay? So please forgive me, I got to explain this for other people too. The idea that the doctrine of the Sephirot, Craig's asking a very good but very complicated question, and he's asking about a point that trips a lot of people up, okay? One is the idea of the Sephiros, okay? The Sephiros are an idea of how Hashem manifests his influence in this world. They are distinct entities separate from Hashem. They are not Hashem. The Sephirot, the way they're described in the Zohar, and particularly how the Arizal describes them, that's the key. If you read it in the Zohar itself, it's very difficult to understand and to fit it in with prior Kabbalah. But if you read it through the Arizal explains how it fits in. From the Ari's perspective, almost the Sephirot are almost like lenses that God shines his light through into this world, but they are not God himself. All right? So we perceive Hashem through the Sephirot, but they are not Hashem himself. So therefore, being that they are a separate created entity and they are not part of Hashem himself, it's not avodah zarah at all. That whole concept goes away. That's not a valid criticism. Now, many academics, and I'm going to knock, I will tell you, there are many people in the academic world of Jewish studies who have tried to say that. It's very clear they never, you can see what they haven't learned when they make these criticisms. You have to look at the Arizal, because the only way that we understand the Zohar in the context of the Masorah comes from the Ari. The second thing over here is the Rambam's concept of God and unity. We have to be careful leaning on the Rambam too much on Inyane Hashkafa. All right. The Rambam was the great rationalist. Whether the Rambam would buy the idea that Kabbalah has any role in Judaism is a point of debate. The 13 Principles of Faith, by the way, by the Rambam, there's a lot of universal debate over those, and you're going to be very hard pressed until the 20th century to find any of the Bali Hashkafa that say we hold by all 13 of them. So the fact that something contradicts the Rambam is not a proof that it's avodah zarah. It's not a proof it's alien to Judaism. It's a proof that a lot of people today, in particular coming from the yeshiva world, might think it is. But it's not, you can't say with 100%. So arguing that the Rambam versus arguing the legitimacy of the Rambam concept against the legitimacy of Kabbalah, you're comparing unicorns to oranges. All right. The Rambam is specifically not entertaining the idea of a world where there is Kabbalah and mysticism. The Zohar lives entirely in a world of Kabbalah and mysticism. So to say that it contradicts the Rambam, you're going to find stuff all over the Zohar that contradicts the Rambam because they're talking about two different views of what Judaism is. The Arizal is really the answer to resolving a lot of those conflicts. All right. You say the vast majority of the world teaches it as Torah. Yes, it is Torah. The Midrash is Torah. The entirety of the Jewish world, the vast majority treats the Zohar as Torah. I'm treating it as Torah also. Midrash is part of Torah. The Midrash is Torah Shabbal Peh. So yes, absolutely. Midrash, I am using Midrash as part of Torah. You say if the Zohar is legitimate Torah, why can't you learn legitimate Torah sources other than the Zohar? So the problem with that question is, I'll tell you right now, the Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer is legitimate Torah, but there's stuff in the Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer that isn't found anywhere else. So why can't we learn the stuff in the Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer from other sources? It's because it doesn't exist in other sources. In the same way, if there's legitimate Torah in the Zohar, you can't learn it from other places because it doesn't exist in other places. So that's what I mean by the question is a little hard to answer because I think there's we may not be defining terms identically. Okay. Tzvi Urzi. Oh, Tzvi, how are you? It's been a very, very long time, my friend. Very, very long time. Tzvi says, is it correct to say that the Zohar preserves the idea of early Kabbalah while creating bounds and systems of analysis that promote study, but also a way to delegitimize incorrect conclusions? Oh, this is an excellent question. I love this question. I love this question. Okay. I'm going to parse it apart. Yes, to say that the Zohar preserves ideas of early Kabbalah, yes, 100%. I think that the creation of the Zohar was sort of like the creation of the Mishnah. It was an Eis Lasos Lashem. We're going to take these ideas that are part and parcel of how we view Torah, tease and abstract them out, and create a body that we're going to call Zohar. This is esoteric. Before there was the Zohar, it was just part of Judaism, and it was intertwined. We're going to abstract and call it esoteric. In the same way that the Mishnah sort of teased out ideas of Torah Shabbal Peh into a concrete structure. If you want to get what I mean by Mishnah, look at the book of the Erste Mishnah by Harav Hagon David Tzvi Hoffman, the Radatz Hoffman, the author of the Shilos Shuvas Malam and L'Choil, the second Rosh Yeshiva of Hildesheimer's in Berlin. Major Posek and Gaon explain how the Mishnah was created. It was an abstraction of things that were just sort of known through Torah Shabbal Peh. I think the Zohar was the same type of a project. However, and this is where I'm going to parse the question, the creation of a system of bounds of analysis that promote study and delegitimize incorrect conclusions, I think that was really what the Arizal in his school were trying to do. I think that's what they were trying to do. Because the Zohar in its raw form, without someone to explain to you what's going on, it's very hard to understand how to interpret it going forward, but it's also very hard to understand it and to plug it into the Masorah that came before it. You need someone like the Arizal. And by the way, if you look in the other writers on Kabbalah before the Arizal, in particular, you look at Rav Moshe Cordovero in the Pardes Ramonim, which is just massive encyclopedic attempt to explain. Everything he wrote was encyclopedic. The part is, Rav Moshe Cordovero would like sneeze and 600 pages would come out. It was insane how much he wrote. It's crazy how much he wrote. He was trying to find a way to explain how the Zohar relates to prior Masorah, and it's very difficult to make that. The Ari, and Craig, I'm going to answer your question and what I'm saying right now, okay? The Arizal was able to demonstrate how the Zohar flowed from and related to earlier Masorah and Kabbalah. The Arizal did not create artificial patches to link them together. All right, you're saying here, oh, we like the fact that he koshered the Zohar, that's why he accepts it. No. Even the people that have severe doubts about the Zohar look at the Ari and they suddenly realize, oh, okay, this concept discussed over here in the Sefer Yetzirah, which is an accepted and legitimate ancient text. Now I see how it manifests in the Zohar. The Zohar opens this up, and now it flows and is consonant with so many other works. I'll give you an example of this, Craig. All right. How do we know Tosfos is legitimate? Do we just like Tosfos's outcome? No, Tosfos solves problems. Tosfos makes connections and sort of flattens out the rhizome of Torah. It makes connections in the Torah and in the learning of Gemara. It draws them together. It points out contradictions and it solves problems. That's what makes it legitimate. That's the idea of a lot of these Gedolim, why they hold that the Ari is legitimate, because he solves the problems. And the Zohar solves a lot of problems. And I'll add to this, by the way, I'm going to add one other thing. Gershom Scholem, who was the academic scholar of Kabbalah, who concluded that the Zohar and Kabbalah were later innovations. A lot of his research today, if you look at Moshe Idel and modern scholars, they have come to realize through the discovery of other manuscripts that a lot of concepts in the Zohar actually predate the Zohar. This is something modern academics agree on. Rav Menachem Kasher, who is the primary disputant of Gershom Scholem, who demonstrated that Gershom Scholem's knowledge of the Talmud and of Jewish texts was not as great as his own, pointed out that there were other texts. There were ancient texts of Kabbalah that predated the Zohar, that did show up in the Zohar, that Moshe DeLeon mostly never saw. I'll give you a famous example. Gershom Scholem, as far as the anachronisms in the Zohar goes, Gershom Scholem famously said that there's a city called Kaputkia mentioned in the Zohar, and he says it shows that the Zohar, the author, did not have any knowledge of the geography of Eretz Yisrael, because Kaputka is actually Cappadocia in Turkey. Ephraim Zalman Margulis, not Ephraim Zalman Margulis, was it? Yeah, the Margulios Hayam. Ephraim Margulis pointed out he's wrong. The Gemara references a city called Kaputkia, and archaeologists later did discover tombstones in Eretz Yisrael in a town called Kaputka. So Gershom Scholem was incorrect. On the linguistic part of it, Rav Menachem Kasher went through the Zohar, and showed that in reality, there's only 4 or 5 legitimate anachronisms. He found words in other pre-Zoharic sources that showed that the words in the Zohar were not actual anachronisms. So modern scholarship is showing that a lot of stuff in the Zohar is way older than we thought it was, because we have more manuscripts available today. So the old view that the Zohar was entirely archaic, was entirely an anachronism, is starting to fall away, and we're finding more and more evidence to connect it to an older tradition. And the manuscripts we're discovering now, the midrashim that are turning up now from Geniza scripts, substantiate everything that the Arizal wrote. So what we're seeing knit together now is that modern academic scholarship is it's not there yet, but it's moving away from Gershom Scholem's, a lot of his original assumptions, which are now generally considered out of date. Yeah. More questions? Unmute yourselves, ask away. Come on, guys. I'm going to stay on for another 5 minutes. We'll end in just a few more, but I want to hear some questions. Nothing? Okay. Well, a big thank you to Rabbi Kleidman. I saw a question in WhatsApp. So I'm not on WhatsApp. I'm not seeing WhatsApp right now. If someone posts, I can't see the WhatsApp group.
Okay, I think Yoni put something in there.
Well, go ahead. What is the question? Can you ask it?
I have to find it. So let's see.
And by the way, just right 1 second, while you're looking that up, I'll mention
it related to our Kriya for Yom Tov. So not a question for anyway.
Yehuda Liebes, Moshe Idel, and Elliot Wolfson are scholars in Eretz Yisrael. They're really pushing back on Gershom Scholem's appraisal of the Zohar. Just incidentally, those are 3 to look at. Yeah.
So Rabbi Bloomenstiel, Avi, my dear friend, thank you so much. This was really fascinating for me. It helps me basically have a much better idea of what do I do with the Zohar. And for that, I thank you. I will send out links to this to everyone once I have the link for the recording. I'm hoping we can find a home for them because, as I said, there's more to come. Hopefully, maybe in conjunction with Rabbi Rich's shul.
Sure, and I'm putting my email address up also. It's admin@dallasbased-in.org. Some of my essays and stuff are on the dallasbased-in.org website, along with the Based In Rofried. Anyone who wants to email me, just shoot me an email to that if you have questions, or even if you have suggestions for future topics.
Okay. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful night and enjoy the rest.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.